what they called assimilate all the savages and all the immigrants, right? So it is kind of like a state church very much in Canada. In about 2 generations, 90% of the Aboriginal population was wiped out. A federal law came in Canada that every Native child, 7 years and older, had to go to these, what they call schools. And if they didn't, their parents would go to jail. So it was a federal law. It started in the year, officially in 1891, when the government and the Catholic, Anglican, and United Churches all got together. The last one closed over 100 years later in 1996. Indians who live on reservation aren't citizens. They're what are called wards of the state, which means they don't have independent legal status. They're like a child or a mentally incompetent person. They've got their own legal system. A classic example of that is in the Catholic Church. There's a standing policy called crimen solicitanus. It's a Latin term, and it governs what you do if children are raped in the Catholic Church. And it says the police are not to be told, the victim is to be silenced, and anyone who talks about it is excommunicated.
Addiction affects millions of people, whether it's junk food, sugar, tobacco, pain medications, or alcohol. Most rehab and addiction programs do not work, and people relapse shortly after they stop. The Truth of Addiction has the answer to some of the toughest questions about addiction. There are many reasons why some people become addicted, but whatever the reason may be, the Truth of Addiction program uses evidence-based ways to help anyone overcome their urges, cravings, and some of the toughest addiction problems. The majority of people do not understand why an addict will do almost anything to obtain their drug of choice. Modern science has allowed researchers to understand addiction in a whole new light. It reveals biochemical and neurological explanations of addiction. This contradicts some aspects of most rehabs using a purely psychological or moral model of treatment. This program works on all types of addictions and can be done in the privacy of your own home. Help you or your loved ones end addiction. Click the link below to learn more. Welcome to Business Game Changers. I'm Sarah Westall. This show is, a continuation of learning about the global trafficking networks. And I have a guest, Kevin Annett. He has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice. And he has written many books on this topic, but one called Murder by Decree. And he was a minister in Canada and learned about the state, Vatican, and Crown sponsored genocide of the Indigenous people in Canada, and how they took children that were 7 and older and put them in these work camps, and over 50% of those children died during that process. And he's going to share with you the atrocities that went on all the way through 1996 in these camps. They called them schools, but they were camps. It's a really important conversation that we have, and people are so in the dark about what's really going on, and it's time that we learn how broad and wide this is, and that people get over their fear, and that we evolve and start and learn that this is not in our nature to hurt our own kind. But before we get into the interview, he does stick around and talks to my patrons a little bit about why it's so important that he does this work. It's a really good message. So if you go over to my Patreon, it's only $1 a month. I'd really appreciate the support there. And also, I want to tell you about the truth about cancer. There is this amazing 9-video series on the truth about cancer. Cancer does not need to be a death sentence. There are cures. There are ways to keep yourself from getting cancer. It's important that this message gets spread. I have the link below. All you need to do is put your email in there, and you'll get signed up to get the whole schedule, and you'll be able to get to the videos. I really am on a mission to get that out. We have 1 out of 2, 50% of our men. This is according to the World Health Association, that over 50%, around 50% of our men are going to have cancer in their lifetime, and 1 out of 3 women. It is an epidemic of proportions that is out of control, and it doesn't need to be. So please please sign up for it and share it with your family and friends. But let's now get into the interview with Kevin Annett. Kevin, thank you so much for joining the show. It's such an honor to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
I have heard some amazing stories about you and what you learned through your ordeal as working in the church. Can you explain what your background is, and then we can start getting into your story?
Sure. Well, in terms of the church, I was raised within the United Church of Canada, which is the largest Protestant denomination in Canada. A little known fact, it was actually set up by the Canadian government in 1925 to help what they called assimilate all the savages and all the immigrants, right? So it is kind of like a state church very much in Canada. And I was ordained into that in my 30s in 1990. And after a couple of posts on the prairies, my young family and I ended up in Port Alberni, which is a large, well, by West Coast standards, a large lumber town, big logging industry traditionally. And also it was the center of the final, really the West Coast missionary invasion that happened in the late 19th century. In about 2 generations, 90% of the Aboriginal population was wiped out. And Port Alberni was the center of that last assault on Vancouver. It's right in the middle of Vancouver Island. Very working class community. I got there, actually the year I got there in 1992, Port Alberni was rated the second worst place to live in British Columbia in terms of all the indicators, poverty, family violence, substance abuse, all of that. So it was a real challenged community when I got there, and right at the bottom of the heap was, of course, the native population. About a third of the people there are native, and yet I noticed this the first week I was there. There were no Indians in churches. There were no Indians in the stores. It was a completely segregated, and it still very much is a segregated community. So I got invited. What clinched it for me, there were 2 things. The first service I had at St. Andrew's United Church, where I was hired as the minister, I looked out and I saw like 10 people in the congregation, and they were all older white folks. And they had hired me to, they realized their congregation was dying. They wanted me to bring in what they called new blood. So I did that. I had a long history in doing community and street ministry in Vancouver. And I went out and just brought in people. Within 6 months, we were up to 100 people. But a lot of those people were poor and they were Aboriginal. And literally the first native home I visited, I was taking food out to a retired native couple. And I kind of naively asked this fellow whose name was Danny Gus, who was a retired fisherman. I said, how come there, I noticed there are no Indians in any of the white churches. What's happening? And he looked at me like I was an idiot, right? And he was looking out the window, and I didn't know at the time, but it looked out over the former, what they were called Indian residential schools. They were really internment camps where children were taken at as young as 7, but usually a lot younger. And he was looking at that school, and he finally turned to me and he said, they killed my best friend in that school. He's buried in the hill out back. And the whites all know that. They don't want us in their churches, right?
Well,
that was a very...
So you're going to explain what internment camps are at some point,
okay.
But keep going.
Well, it's a prison camp. Under law, in 1920, a federal law came in Canada that every native child, 7 years and older, had to go to these, what they call schools. And if they didn't, their parents would go to jail. So it was a federal law. And
did they have to live there, or was it like a public school?
Yeah. No, a residential school. They lived there full time. I've talked to many survivors, and I've interviewed hundreds of them, probably thousands actually, over the years. And they constantly told me they never saw their parents 5, 6, 7 years. They were kept there full time, even in the summers, even on holidays. And the reason they were is because it was really a slave labor institution. They gave kids minimal reading and writing, but after that they then put the boys at work in the fields, hire them out to local employers. The girls would be trained as domestics. It was really just slave labor and a lot of brainwashing, and half the children died. So it was also a place where these kids died.
When did this start and when did it end?
Well, I should show folks, this is my book, Murder by Decree, The Crime of Genocide in Canada. And you can get that online, murderbydecree.com. It's a compilation of 25 years of research I've done based on eyewitness testimonies, government documents, church documents. It started in the year officially in 1891 when the government and the Catholic, Anglican, and United Churches all got together. And the last one closed over 100 years later in 1996.
It took till now through 96. Were they doing the same thing, or did it get better in the late? Or is it the same thing through 96?
Same thing, really. The death rate we found, it's easy to plot the early death rate because it's all on the records that I've published. 40 to 60% of the kids never came back. Now, that's a death rate higher than in the slave trade, higher than the Nazi death camps, which on average were about 15 to 20% death rate, because they were labor camps as well. These were extermination centers, and there was a Dr. Peter Bryce who worked for the Indian Affairs Department in the early 20th century. He was commissioned to go do a study of these Indian schools. Most of them were in the West. And he came back, and here's a quote from his report: "I believe the conditions are being deliberately created to spread infectious disease." Now, what he meant by that was he described a practice where the healthy children were deliberately locked in the same dorms as kids dying of tuberculosis and smallpox, and then they were never treated. They deliberately infected them. We've had eyewitnesses in our documentary film on Repentant in 2007. We had eyewitnesses saying, yeah, the nuns would lock us in. They would never let in fresh air. They would never treat us. Kids were dying around us. And it takes a while to die from tuberculosis, right? So definitely an intent to depopulate these areas.
And the nuns were doing it.
Nuns, priests, Protestant and Catholic clergy. It was a uniform policy. That's what Dr. Bryce discovered. All the churches were doing it. So that's coming from a central place, a central policy. It isn't just, the bad apples theory that there are these, a few sadistic priests doing this. No, you don't get 50,000 or more children dying because of underfunding or negligence, right?
Do you want to save some serious money? Learn how a simple gadget can double your gas mileage while creating less pollution. The simple gadget does all of this while giving your car more power and longer engine life. Learn more with the link below. Were there any of these people that were part of the clergy that said, this isn't part of my faith, or did they all follow? I mean, you said this isn't part of my faith when you started learning, but do you have any pattern of that?
I've only found one other clergy person over the last 20 years that actually stepped out and said no. Unfortunately, the system, it's like in any corporate system where there's crime going on, people know that if it's coming from the top, everybody has to do it. I had a classic case of that. A woman called Marion McFarland came to one of our forums in Vancouver years ago, and she said that she had been a matron at the Port Alberni School in the early 60s. She found another matron beating a little girl with a piano leg, killing her. And so Marion grabbed that woman and knocked her cold to defend the little girl. John Andrews, the principal, then fired Marion, not the woman who was beating the girl. And he said, here's a quote from John Andrews: "Anything that happened to that little squaw would have been preferable to losing that woman because she plays the organ in church on Sundays."
Oh, my gosh. Who cares that she killed a little girl?
It's acceptable. You see, in a system of genocide, there's like two standards. One standard for the targeted population, one is standard for everybody else, and that includes legally too. Like in Canada still, Indians who live on a reservation aren't citizens. They're what are called wards of the state, which means they don't have independent legal status. They're like a child or a mentally incompetent person. Mm-hmm. So anything can be done to them. During the swine flu, so-called swine flu outbreak years ago, they were going onto reservations, the health department, and testing out the Tamiflu drugs on Indians because under the Indian Act, they're not allowed to refuse medical treatment.
Yeah, I know that I had somebody else on that was saying that everything is tested on the Indians first.
Yeah, well, legally they can do that.
They chipped them and everything.
They can't refuse it or they go to jail because they're not citizens under the law. Now, that's illegal under international law, but the Indian Act is still in place in Canada. So,
and I've also heard that the largest, and I've heard this from some of my CIA sources, whatever, the largest pedophile rings just recently have been found on the Indian reservations.
Absolutely, because you see, not only are they not citizens, but reservations are run by chiefs who are on the government payroll. Uh, the number of times I've had this told to me when I'm on reservation, saying, "Oh yeah, it's the chiefs who deal the local drugs, the crack and the crystal meth. They're the ones who traffic the kids." It's like a banana republic, and honest people don't have a recourse. It's like in the church when you asked about if there are other clergy. It's a culture of silence. You're not supposed to talk about it. They've got their own legal system. A classic example of that is in the Catholic Church. There's a standing policy called crimen solicitanus. It's a Latin term, and it governs what you do if children are raped in the Catholic Church. And it says the police are not to be told. The victim is to be silenced, and anyone who talks about it is excommunicated. So what do you
And
do if you're
the
not?
media won't share that with people.
It's strange, I've tried sharing that constantly when, like what happened in Pennsylvania recently, and all these exposures of priests and bishops doing this. When they're covering it up, they're just following Vatican policy coming right from the Pope. And so it's kind of like accusing somebody in the mafia of killing people as if it wasn't ordered.
Exactly.
It's like,
Wow. Okay. But this was a systematic thing that they were doing to children. Then you realize why they don't, pedophilia, all that stuff. I mean, if they can go and they can do genocide against the whole population within a church, they can do anything.
Exactly. I think that's the point. I mean, we found early on interviewing people, there were these things called Indian hospitals where natives were brought in under laws, which we've published. If you were a traditionalist, if you were marrying into the traditional bloodlines or speaking your language or trying to hold on to your culture, you were targeted for sterilization. They were sent into these hospitals and sterilized. Now, under the UN Convention on Genocide, trying to prevent births, that's a classic indication of genocide, the intent to commit genocide, wiping out a people. They were doing this all over. There were lawsuits involving thousands of Native women who were sterilized involuntarily.
Well, that's what Israel was doing to black Africans or black Israelis in Israel. So that's an indication of the attempt to do that. Interesting. Keep going.
Well, definitely. In America, something like a third of all the women in Puerto Rico were sterilized in the 1970s. You find it all over Indian reservations. On our documentary film Unrepentant, there's a woman, Charlotte Stewart, in Vancouver, who said as recently as 1997, she was told by the social worker that she had to have a tubal ligation if she wanted to see her children again, that there was a policy that women on welfare, if they got sterilized, had their tubes tied, they could have easier access to their kids. So that's a policy happening now. And like you say, it was like pioneered among natives because they were expendable, but then they can do it to anybody at that point. Right?
Did they ever do it to white people, poor white people in any area? Right. Or have we uncovered any of that?
There's a good book written on that by Edwin Black. It's called War Against the Weak, America's Plan to Create a Master Race. And he talks about the sterilization laws first brought in the late 19th century in America. Really, the American medical community advocated it. And it was aimed initially at what they call the feeble-minded. Anybody with an IQ below 85 or anything was slated under law. I think 38 states had laws allowing sterilization of feeble-minded people. But in Canada, they took those laws and broadened them so that if you were Aboriginal, you were considered inherently to be substandard intelligence. It was that whole racist model that, Asians and blacks and Aboriginal people just were dumber. They didn't have our IQ. And on that basis, they could be sterilized. And that was the rationale for the laws in British Columbia and Alberta.
I wish we could do a sterilization eradication process for anybody who doesn't have decency and are lower humans because they can't have empathy and they don't care about others. Maybe that's a different way to look at people. But anyways, keep going.
Well, no, what's indicative of, and I talk about that in my book, Murder by Decree, when the schools were set up in the 1920s, well, they started really in the 1890s, but they kicked into high gear after World War I. They were targeted mostly in the West because that's where most of the Aboriginal people were still living, who weren't, domesticated, who weren't living on reservation. So these were aimed specifically at wiping out traditional people. And, we have constant proof of that.
What was their thoughtful, if there is thoughtfulness here, what was their reason for it? Did they have any kind of public stance that they gave to the average person on why they're doing what they're doing?
To civilize the savage. It was assumed that, there was a whole cover story that these schools were benign places. Yeah, some bad things happened. It's this whole cover-up that happened. The government did a whitewash called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where the commission was set up by the people who did it, the churches and government, and certain things couldn't be reported and looked into, like the death of children. But as part of that, they claimed only 3,000 children died, which is absurd. It was well into the tens of thousands, even by their own figures, and yet they're denying their own statistics by saying that. But their whole line is that it was a good intent gone awry. It was an attempt to educate children, bring them, assimilate them. You see, genocide uses certain catchwords, like in World War II, when people were being wiped out, it was called relocation. They weren't called death camps; they were relocation centers. Genocide in Canada, they didn't call it genocide; they called it assimilation, which actually means to eat something. It was to absorb and destroy a culture, but they don't talk about how it happened. So the official line was, we're trying to do this to help the poor Indians. In fact, there was all this murder going on under the guise of that.
Through 96, they were doing it. Were the death rates consistent through 96, or did it change? We didn't get to that.
They dropped. The high point was, I've got this all tabulated in Murder by Decree. The high point was between around 1900 right up to after World War II, 1950. We had Dr. Bryce in 1907 saying half the children are dying. Neil Curry, the head of the Indian Affairs Department in 1949, is saying half the children never survive, so that's 40 years apart. Then it began to go down after World War II because, not because they got any more benign, but they began to privatize the schools. They began to phase out the schools because a lot of these reports were beginning to get out of crime and misdeed. So they began to, the whole white foster care system. There's more children now, more Native children in white foster homes than there ever were in residential schools, because it's part of the way you destroy a culture. You get kids to forget who they are, can't relate to their own family. They began to do that more and more, and that way the crime is more hidden, right? It's hidden in homes. It's not in central institutions. And that's tended to be what happened. Some of the band councils would take over the operation on the schools on their own reservations, and yet the abuse and the crime continued because a lot of these chiefs had been doing it to each other when they were kids. I mean, it's the sickness is passed on intergenerationally, and that's the trouble with this stuff.
Well, now we have a system, I know in the United States, where over 50% of the kids are sexually abused in the foster care system, in the system. So now it's really spreading out to the entire week, if you will. I mean, it's just, it's a very sick system. And you think that's by design?
Yeah, well, I mean, for a number of reasons. I think generally speaking, if you're a small elite and you want to maintain power over the majority of people, you do it through fear. And the best way to do that is to traumatize people at a young age. It's why, there's such massive sexual abuse going on against children, and then yet nothing's ever done about it. The laws in Canada, do you know it's more of a crime under the Criminal Code of Canada to possess a marijuana plant than it is to rape a child?
Oh, my gosh.
2 to 5 years for a pot possession, 1 year mandatory sentence for raping of child. That's a message.
Well, how much is it to rape an adult woman? Do you know?
Oh, higher. Mandatory 5 to 10 years normally for statutory rape, but
it should be
children,
at least as high, if not higher, because you're destroying their life. Not that you aren't destroying a woman's life, but you know what I'm saying.
They're an adult. There's more coping mechanisms you have than when you're a kid, and it's really a form of genocide. The attack on children, because you've destroyed that person's essence, that their innocence, their ability to have a life. you've destroyed it and any of their descendants. You're really wiping out whole bloodlines by doing this, right? And people lose the bigger picture here is that rape it's defined now under international law as a crime against humanity.
Well, good.
Raping anyone.
And I know that when soldiers go into villages and things and they rape the women and the young women in front of their families, they do that on purpose.
Right.
To destroy the whatever.
Well,
go ahead.
To talk about the Indian schools, I've talked to employees and former students who say it was mandatory rape. Every child who arrived was raped.
Oh my
They were
gosh.
lined up, and they had their heads shaved, they were given uniforms, they were given numbers, not names, and they were raped.
So they actually were dressed. They dressed in like some gray drab outfit, shaved their head, and raped them when they came in. That's
right. Numerous people describe having that happened. Even the government and churches admit that happened. They don't admit the mandatory rape part, but they admit the other things.
That's treating them worse than animals.
They were seen as animals. They were seen as not human. I guess that's the way you rationalize doing that to another human being. Who knows?
Now, was this all the way through the top of the church?
Well, it was authorized from the top, very top.
And is this the Protestant or all the different churches, like the Vatican?
All of them.
Okay.
Well, here's the thing. Historically, over 2/3 of the churches were Catholic run. The plan for the Indian schools, both in America and Canada, was a Jesuit plan created by a missionary called Paul Duryea on the West Coast in the 1860s. You see, they took the model the Jesuits used in Europe over the centuries, where they would convert a king or a prince or somebody, and then all their children would be Catholics, and then they would be used as a lever, against their people. That happened. Like my family, Annett, it's a French name. We were Huguenots, French Protestants who had to leave. We were burned out of France in the 1500s and had to come to Europe or to England. That was standard Jesuit policy to do that. Now, they transplanted that to North America, and what they did is they had what they called a watchman system, where the Catholic missionaries would go into an Indian village, get rid of the traditional leaders either by killing them, poisoning, deporting them. They would set in puppet chiefs who were converted Catholics, and then they would watch everybody in their village to see anyone speaking their language, anyone who was still a heathen and not converted, they'd target them. They used that as the model of the Indian school, and all of the churches and the governments adopted it. So it was a Jesuit plan originally to how you control, not only destroy the original people, their identity, but then control them using puppet chiefs. And that's exactly the system on every reservation in North America now.
Jeez. Okay, so now what happened to you when you started realizing this? And you went through a transformation, and it was tough. Can you explain your story?
Well, I had to, frankly, I think in life, it's only when you're really kicked in the teeth that you start waking up, depending on your degree of complicity and ignorance. But when I discovered, and one of my other books, At the Mouth of a Cannon, this is the more recently published one. They're all on Amazon. I describe in there how I found out that the United Church that I'd been working for had been taking native land grabbed by the original missionaries and then selling it off to logging companies and others for a lot of money, right? None of the money ever going back to the Indians. So I found out a case after I'd been at St. Andrews for over 2 years. I'd grown the congregation to over 100. We were thriving every Sunday. The church was full. I found out that the church had done this. They had grabbed land of the Ahousaht people on the west coast of Vancouver Island and sold it off to Weyerhaeuser, the biggest U.S. logging company. It's based out of Seattle. And so there was this deal going on between the government, the church, the company. And I wrote a letter about that to the church higher up. I said, wait a minute, our policy says we're not allowed to do that. When we have native land, stolen native land or possession is to be returned to that native nation, not sold off to our business friends. And I wrote that. 3 weeks later, I was summarily removed from my pulpit without cause, without notice, totally in violation of the manual governing clergy in the United Church. I was told that if I wanted to keep not just my job, but my ordination as a minister, I had to agree to psychiatric evaluation, retraining without pay for a year, even though I had 2 little children to support. All of these stupid demands,
but
no
all
basis.
You did all you did is say the land shouldn't go back to them at this
I
point?
cited church policy, and next thing I knew, I was not only out on my can, I was then threatened with defrocking unless I became the scapegoat and said, yeah, I was crazy, I shouldn't have done that. And I wouldn't agree to that, and so I was fired. They then approached my wife, Ann, about 2 weeks later and said, this all came out in divorce court, and the church admitted it later. They said to her, we're going to make sure this guy never works again. If you want to leave him, we'll help you. We'll pay for your divorce. And that's exactly what they did. They got custody.
The church did this.
Yeah, church officials. And as a result, I lost custody of my children. I was impoverished. I couldn't work. I was living on Skid Row, frankly, out of my car. And then when I tried to retrain to get a PhD at the University of British Columbia based on all this research I was uncovering, that was blocked. The United Church made sure I didn't get funding. One of their people on faculty. It's all documented in Unrepentant, our documentary, and other sources. But then I began to realize, and a lot of other people realized, well, if they're going to spend so much money, over $250,000 to throw me out of the church, one minister, right? All of this stuff, why? Like, why are they doing this to this one guy? And that began to open doors, and other things began to come out.
But at this point, you thought it was just on land. You didn't realize anything else?
I didn't realize it till survivors came to me, because after I got fired by the church, my credibility went way up in the native world. Right? And one old guy said, oh, they fired you. You must have been doing something right,
Sometimes that's true. In this case, obviously.
And so they began, because the trust level had gone up, the survivors shared with me a lot more about what had been going on. And then I went, aha, okay, now I can see they're worried. And sure enough, that next year, in February 1996, the first lawsuits in Canada began against the churches and government. And I was an advisor to that first group of plaintiffs. And the church immediately denied a cover-up and all this. They panicked. And within a couple of years, there were over 10,000 lawsuits being brought against the Catholics, the Anglicans, the United Church. And we began to build a whole movement that eventually forced an apology out of the government, an acknowledgement of some of these things. But it took many years of struggle, public campaigning, protests. We're doing protests outside and inside churches. We created a real stink, got a lot of media coverage, and they eventually had to start acknowledging stuff. But they also covered up a lot at the same time. So it's an ongoing kind of struggle to continually bring out this stuff,
Well, it's just amazing. It was just land that you started with, and then I would think it raised a whole bunch of red flags, like, why are you overreacting over land? And then you're like, oh, they probably thought you knew a lot more and that you were fighting for a different reason, and then...
It could be, but it was interesting when the Vancouver Sun reported the way it happened after I was fired. Some friends and I had a protest, a picket outside the United Church office in Vancouver, and a woman called Harriet Nahani heard about it and came down to the protest. Harriet Nahani was the first woman ever to go public in Canada about witnessing the murder of a child at a residential school, a little girl called Maisie Shaw. Harriet, when she was a young girl in 1946, she was hiding under the stairs on Christmas Eve and avoiding the principal, Alfred Caldwell, who raped her every night. And she heard arguing going on at the top of the stairs. And Caldwell was arguing with a matron, and there was a little girl, Maisie Shaw. She was 14, but very young for her age, and she was crying for her mother. Harriet turned and watched. She said Caldwell kicked her in the stomach. She went rolling down the stairs, landed right next to Harriet with her eyes open, not breathing or moving. And she described that. That was reported. Within a week, I was approached by lawyers saying we have a lot more of these stories. And I began to get a real education about what I had been in Port Alberni. I didn't even realize at the time, although I'd heard some stories anecdotally, the hard evidence began to come out. More eyewitnesses came forward. It was a snowball at that point.
Well, whenever you see a lot of poverty and people just really struggling, it's usually a sign of abuse and trauma. Poverty and people struggling and doing things that aren't for their best interest doesn't just happen. It's a long-term trauma situation.
Absolutely. I remember, when I was working before my PhD got scuttled, I accessed all of these records at the Kerner Library at University of British Columbia. It was all the early microfilmed records of the residential schools, and in it we found not only evidence of the 50% death rate and letters from parents saying our children are being killed, but also there was a letter from a doctor describing how he was a dentist and he would prescribe painkiller to some students but not others. The children who were to be punished had their teeth yanked and drilled without painkiller as a torture. Here we are in a healing circle that same week, and an older woman said, yeah, they used to pull our teeth without painkiller. And I hand her the document. I say, here's the proof from this doctor, 1934 in Vancouver, describing it, 2 columns, with painkiller, without painkiller. There's the document. There's the eyewitness. That's all you need in a court of law. Do you think any of the newspapers would print that stuff? I mean, forget it. There was a complete blackout on that kind of evidence. You could talk about physical and sexual assault. That had been the deal worked out with the chiefs, that, personal injury lawsuits, tort offenses, not criminal, but tort, you can be apologized and compensated. But criminality, genocide, murder, sterilizations, torture, none of that was ever talked about in the Canadian media. It was, and still is, very whitewashed, right?
Well, how much of that came out from like the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s? Because that's recent enough where people could go to prison and we can nail people.
Well, yeah, but, it's come out all the time. It's been going on constantly. And yet here's the thing. We tried this early on. We would go to the police, which often in Canada means the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who were complicit. They were the ones who brought children into these schools. They would track down the children when they ran away. So the RCMP, they're one of the defendants in this trial, right? The RCMP always say the same thing. That's before the courts. We can't do anything about it. And I said, I know a murder scene. There's a crime scene. There's children buried in the ground. Why don't you investigate? They refuse. They absolutely refuse to investigate these mass grave sites. And we were the only people in Canada who ever excavated a mass grave in Brantford, Ontario in 2011. And we were invited by the Mohawk elders to come there. We went there with archaeologists, and we found bones and buttons off school uniforms. These bones turned out to be that of a child, 5-year-old girl, they figure.
How involved was the British government in this?
Completely. The Vatican and the Crown of England were the 2 main perpetrators. They were set up under Crown sanction in 1920. Not only the Crown authorized it, and the Vatican ran most of them, but there was a eyewitness, William Coombs, who said that in 1964 he saw Queen Elizabeth come to the school he was in, the Kamloops School in British Columbia, and take 10 children away, and these kids were never seen again. And
what was she doing? What did they think she did with them?
We don't know. They never commented. Buckingham Palace was issued a subpoena. They ignored it during our first common law court trial in 2012. It was interesting. There were 10 children on October 10th, 1964. All the numbers add up to 10 if you look at it. And I think it had cultic significance. But, it's speculation until there's more evidence, right?
It's just incredible. I mean, the numbers that are coming out everywhere is absolutely incredible. Now, one thing that you mentioned, which actually gives me chills, is the fact that people follow orders and people follow and they're afraid to stand up and do what's right. How long has that been going on in general with the regular population? Because we're trying to get this out, and it seems like a lot of people have cognitive dissonance and they just don't do anything.
That's true. It's a reaction to grief. And horrible stuff. You simply deny it, and that's what a lot of people do. But again, the human capacity to live alongside this evil, part of it is the way that in a corporate system, and this is what we're living under, whether it's church, government, military, whatever, in a corporate system, it's a hierarchy. And if the pattern is set on top, everybody follows, and you're compartmentalized. You're given one little piece of the job to do. And they find that it's why, like in a firing squad, the soldiers who are shooting are told there's a blank. One of your rifles has a blank. If you've seen movies where the president is given the launch code for the nuclear weapons, there's always the second man who has to validate that. That's not for security reason. That's because the second man hypothesis is that if you believe that somebody else is responsible for a decision, you can press the button more easily because you've deferred responsibility to another character. It's what happens in a platoon. Oh, Sarge told me to do this. He got orders from the captain. That's what we do as people. We defer the responsibility, and so we can do heinous crimes because we're just seen to be one cog in the wheel. It's not really us who's doing it, right? That's how these systems operate. And when everybody in a system is doing it, they have a vested interest in keeping it quiet, which is why they come down hard on somebody like me, because if one element in that system cracks, the whole thing could be exposed. So the whole thing has to be denied. Witnesses have to be silenced. They've got to be put up fake stories. It's what you do in a system of genocide. And you never report your own crimes. In Japan, still to this day, they don't teach in the schools what the Japanese army did in China in the 1930s, kill over 10 million people. That's not mentioned in the Japanese history books any more than any of our stuff is mentioned in any Canadian history book. We've tried, and the school boards continually scuttle any of this evidence getting onto the curriculum.
How much of this is happening in the United States, in our Indian reservations and our country?
The same process, but it was different in America. The churches didn't have the kind of colonial power that they have in Canada. Very early on, there were two things. The Bureau of Indian Affairs ran most of them. The first school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, set up after the Civil War. Those, by the turn of the century, around 1900, the BIA had taken over a lot of them, rather than the missionary societies. Although the Jesuits were big, the Catholic Church ran most of the remaining Indian schools. And also in 1924, American Indians were granted the right of full citizenship. They had to surrender their treaty rights and their culture and everything, but they still were full citizens. They still aren't in Canada. Under the Indian Act, you're not a citizen. So American Indians have a little bit of an advantage, but to show you how similar...
Not to interrupt, is that because it's still under the Crown?
That's right. Under Crown authority...
It's worse because they have direct control of Canada.
They do, and the Crown owns all land. The Crown owns everything. The Canadian government is run by the Governor-General, the Queen's appointee, who can remove the government at any time. It's the old colonial system. The old boy is running everything, right?
There's a reason we got out. It just people say that we're still in it, and it's all corporatized, and they run it from behind the scenes. But
maybe, but you have the idea that it shouldn't be that way, and that's different. You have the idea that you're a citizen of a republic, where the people are sovereign, not the government, and that's a very radical idea. In Canada, you're taught in school you're a subject of the Crown. That's the language used, subject. Right.
To this person who thinks that they can go and do whatever they want. Why would people be subject to another person, to another human being? To me, that's a foreign concept. Nobody should accept that. But keep going.
Absolutely. Well, that's my American half speaking. My dad's an American.
Yeah. Well, everybody should think that. Who cares? There's some... In fact, if they think the British, they're lower human beings if they have those thoughts. Not the British, I mean, the Crown, the Vatican. I mean, they're the ones that need to rise their vibrations. When it comes down to Judgment Day, who's going to be held back? The ones who look at other people as animals, or the ones who look at everybody and value everybody? The levels change suddenly, right? They might think I'm lower here, but suddenly when it comes to Judgment Day and you're meeting your creator, I suddenly am people like you are in a different spot than they are.
Right. Well, that's two very different notions of human nature. And you got Roman law that says, people are given rights by a sovereign and the rights can be taken away. And then there's the common law tradition out of Europe that says, no, you're born with rights. They're self-evident because they're inbred. They're born in us. They're not given or taken away. You just practice them.
God created them. We were given it to us by our Creator. We're equal in the eyes of the creation.
Hey, that's what the U.S. Supreme Court has said time and again, that statutory law has no power over people without your consent. Doesn't matter what a government brings in. Doesn't matter what a statute is. You're not harming anybody. You've done nothing wrong. They can go away.
Yeah. Well, it's about time that we're stepping up and we're doing something about this stuff and we're saying no more, and that we want healthy communities. We don't want this kind of crap going on, and if the state is going to endorse this, we're going to replace the state with something else, because we want healthy communities for our children, for everybody, because we are all creation. You know, we all believe in that equality at birth.
I would like to think that we all believe that, but
well, the people who don't need to
Yeah.
lose.
Yeah.
It's time
Well,
for them to
you know,
lose instead of the other way around.
I go all over the world giving lectures on this stuff, and I see that everywhere, that rising, that awakening in people, exactly along the lines of what you're saying. We're reclaiming ourselves, right? And it's long overdue. Getting back to what we were talking about with Canada, is that people are so conditioned to obey authority that it's been really difficult here getting this work out. Because I'm seen as a traitor, that I'm indicting church and state, right?
Well, because the church the church is beautiful. They preach about beauty and love, and then they do that. How do people do that? How do they reconcile? I still don't get it. I really don't, because I couldn't be that. I'd be one of the few percentage that would say, I can't do this. I'd be you.
You can do it as long as you're not stepping on the big toes. Like my, mistake, if you want to call it a mistake, which I don't think is the best thing I ever did in my life. But when I wrote that letter about the land deal, I was challenging the big money behind the church. So if I had been talking about any other issue, the United Church campaigns about human rights all over the world, but not in their own backyard, what they did, any other issue, I'd still be in the church. But I was naming the names of their crime. And once you do that, you're beyond the pale, and you're just slated for erasing, which is what happened.
Well, good for you. Good. Now you got a little stripe on your collar for getting fired for a good cause. I think everybody deserves.
Sarah, what else can you do if you're a moral being? I don't
totally get it.
I just did what anyone with a conscience would do, right?
That's my point. That's why I don't quite understand where the church is teaching people to be loving and have a conscience. So why are these people not being loving and have a conscience? I don't understand that. I don't get what's wrong with the human nature where we're so fearful. That fear of standing up against Big Brother when Big Brother's doing atrocious crimes.
Well, there's kind of on a bigger level, I don't know if we've evolved enough as a species to overcome fear with truth and love. Some of us do. Some of us do it second nature. A lot don't. And I don't think it's just from the way we're conditioned. There is that whole herd mentality that you go with the pack. And I encounter that all the time. But it's okay, because it's never majorities who are needed to change something. We, with only a couple of dozen people across Canada, we forced this issue onto the agenda. We forced an apology and recognition. We even were involved in helping depose Pope Benedict in 2013 because of our court cases in Europe. And so if you're a handful and you're standing on the truth and you're persistent, you have amazing power.
Well, because the people know you're truthful, but I've been too involved in watching a herd and watching people. Yeah. At first they're appalled, and the next thing I know, they're following the herd. And it's really quite strange, and how powerful that is. But you have to be strong, and you have to just step out of the herd and say, this is wrong.
You do, and that has an amazing ripple effect, just one act of conscience like that. But you got to keep doing it over and over, and then your effect is exponential. It's huge. So that's why I often say to people, don't give up. Just keep doing what you know is right, and don't worry about the response. You're planting seeds, and future generations are going to reap, right? I mean, that's how I look at it.
Well, you are amazing. You've been nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize, from what I understand. And you should have won it, but we've given it to other players who, maybe Obama or somebody else who might not have deserved it. Do you think you'll end up winning it one of these years?
No. That's all right.
No way.
But that's all right. It doesn't matter. Interestingly, it was American scholars who nominated me. Nobody in Canada would dare. But no, I think the only reason it would be nice to have that is the exposure it would give to the issue.
Yes,
and,
exactly. I understand, because then it gives it legitimacy, which you shouldn't have to have that another stripe like that. Like you had to get fired to be legitimate to the local population. That's funny. Yeah. It's true. But you shouldn't have to have that stripe to have it be legitimate. But it is amazing how much those kinds of symbols matter to people.
Yeah, it's true. It's unfortunate.
We
don't feel, we're not confident to just stand on our own. We have to get some father figure to say, oh yes, he's right. You can support him now, right?
Yeah, I don't think that way, but a lot of people do. It's like, that's why people in the alternative media or whatever, I'll see they'll get somebody who has a PhD or whatever, and then they really make a point to say that they're a doctor because they're afraid to stand up to it's that same concept of just truth is truth. Truth has beauty to it. And we all know what's right. I don't know about all of us, but the majority of us. We don't need father figure especially if father figure is part of the state and the state's the one perpetrating the crimes.
Yeah, well, don't forget the state is an abstraction. It's just people. And we found that when we started protesting the churches, the cops would show up. So I'd always make a point of talking to the head sergeant and say, do you know that this Catholic Church has a policy of protecting child rapists and not telling you guys when a child is raped? Are you seriously going to stand there and defend that institution? Because that makes you an accessory under the law to a crime. And it's funny because they'll listen and they'll talk and they'll either not intervene or go away.
Well, it bothers them, right? They're like, oh God, I don't want to.
Their dads, their grandfathers, they know this stuff is true. So it's a battle for hearts and minds. And the very fact that the government had to respond shows we won the battle, right? Now it's a matter of they just camouflage the truth with a lot of words and deception.
I know a lot of military are the ones that are like, holy crap. And you could get the military to do a coup if we had the right leaders and the right stuff going on. And in fact, I think there's a soft coup going on right now. Indications are, and the military is, for the most part, behind it because they're the ones that see it all the time.
They do. I know. And
they don't like it. They're normal people too. So well, I thank you so much for joining me. I know you don't have very much time, and I would love to have you back because we could dive into a lot of these topics.
I very much think we need to do more interviews because there's whole other parts to this we haven't touched on, like what we're doing now with the campaign in Europe. I work with groups all over the world in, stopping child trafficking, which is a big global industry, of course. And so, we need to.
Yeah, I would love to. It's something that I spent a lot of time. I have an interesting case that I just got done working on that has plagued the community I grew up in. That was really a national story, and they were covering it up for 3 decades. Just incredible information.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, and I really appreciate it. Would you do me a favor and stay after for like a 10-minute segment for my patrons?
Oh, sure. Okay. Sure, yeah.
Where can people get hold of you?
Well, you can write to me, thecommonland@gmail.com. My websites are, our main book, Murder by Decree, is online, murderbydecree.com. The tribunal I work with, the International Tribunal of Crimes of Church and State, it's itccs.org. And my own website is kevinannett.com.
And now they can get your books on your website. They can also get it at Amazon. Are they all over the place?
Amazon.com, put in Kevin Annett, you'll see all the books. And I went on a writing splurge of the last 3 years. I've published 11 books, so all on this and other topics. So, but yeah, education's the first step. And I'm on the speaking tour half the time. I'm on one now as we speak. So I'll come anywhere, especially in America. I love American audiences. They're more willing to challenge authority than up in the great wide north.
That's what we need. Thank you so much.
Thank you.